The main event, as I spoke about, is my friend Jacob Arriola. He is an amazing developer from Zeek Interactive here in Orange County area. Although you guys may be spread all over the world now. You just let me know. But
yeah, we're pretty international.
That's awesome. When Jacob's not, crushing it on the front end development side of things for Zeek, he's often crushing me at a round of golf. The guy's a monster. So
No.
yeah. So I will hand it over to you, Jacob. We are recording tonight's meetup. I will get it sort of edited and post it up to the meetup group. So if you're on there and you just look at the comments, I'll put it up there so you can watch it back. But Jacob, I'll give it over to you.
Cool. Thanks for the intro. Hello, everyone. I'm Jacob. I am a developer at Zeek. Definitely focus on the front end side of things, on the UI side of things. Tonight, we are talking about kind of continuing on. I guess this group has been talking about headless WordPress for the last 5 meetups, feels like that. It's kind of
it's been
an ongoing thing.
October, I think.
Wow, that's cool. I'm specifically talking about tonight, headless WordPress in a eCommerce, WooCommerce context with that lens on. So previously we've talked about kind of headless WordPress, kind of just with post and pages and custom post types. Now we're kind of talking about headless with WooCommerce, right? So I think I spoke to Brandon at the beginning of the summer when I took on a project about how I was going to do something like that. And he's like, oh boy, that's, that's a mouthful. That's a big deal. So I don't know, how much experience everyone has with WooCommerce. We're going to probably be spending very little on the WooCommerce side. We're going to be spending a lot on the UI side of things. And so we'll see how far we get. We may just get one page up depending on questions and answers and stuff, or we may get through a full-on application. I'm pretty much just going to be demoing and writing the code out and making it interactive. So if you have any questions or anything as I'm going through, I think, what is it, Brandon? We just hit the chat.
I was going to say, yeah, first question right off the bat. We've already got one in the chat, and this may be a softball for you. But someone's asking if you can define what headless means.
Oh, sure. Yeah, for sure. So traditionally, WordPress is a monolithic type of architecture, meaning WordPress is responsible for everything, meaning front-end delivery, right? The actual HTML, JavaScript, CSS that public users see. Also the actual CMS, where maybe back-end users log in. So it pretty much handles everything in one thing, right? And so when you talk about headless, what headless means, it kind of decouples the UI layer outside of WordPress. And so now WordPress is only responsible for the CMS, and the UI is designated to a different layer. That could be just plain old HTML, or it could be kind of like a React application or Vue or whatever the case may be. So when we say headless, it's more kind of decoupled. It's really talking about the UI layer. WordPress is no longer responsible for delivering public HTML to your public visitors, right? All it is responsible for is the CMS layer, meaning database, logging in WooCommerce context, all these store functionality, things like that. I don't know, Brandon, if you want to fill in any gaps there.
That's great. If we have any further questions, I'll bubble them up for you.
Cool. For sure. So that's the context we're going to be speaking in. Let me share my screen. Let's see if this works. Cool. All right. You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Should be a WordPress site. WordPress backend. All right, sweet.
Yeah.
So I've got WordPress kind of running locally on my machine here. Yep, WordPress.local. I've got WooCommerce installed. And if you're not familiar with WooCommerce, we can quickly take a step back and say WooCommerce is a free WordPress plugin that allows you to turn your WooCommerce or your WordPress site into an e-commerce store, right? Right out of the bat, you're able to add products, add a payment gateway, and start selling things. So the short answer, WooCommerce is a free WordPress plugin to turn your WordPress site into a e-commerce store, right? So what I'm going to be talking tonight about is like that headless type of environment but with WooCommerce. So I'm going to be dealing with Gatsby. So if you're not familiar with Gatsby, Gatsby is a React framework for building out static sites, right? So static sites talk about kind of, building out all the HTML pages ahead of time at build time, as opposed to traditionally with WordPress, right? All that stuff is server side, where a request comes in, maybe there's a query, the database lookup, and then the HTML gets delivered. Gatsby, because it's a static site generator, builds all those pages ahead of time, right? And so I'm going to be demoing out, building out the UI and all the e-commerce functionality, like add to cart, and maybe checkout if we have enough time. All that's going to be handled outside the scope of WordPress and specifically in the scope of Gatsby, but it's going to be talking to WordPress, and we'll be kind of seeing that happen. So in terms of like APIs and stuff like that, right? So WordPress has a REST API that's part of core, and it's great. It's been around a few years, 3-4 years in core, and before that it was a plugin. I'm going to be using, and I think last month, Frontity guys spoke about the REST API a little bit, probably. But I'm going to be dealing with a different API. It's called a GraphQL API. So I believe Jason Ball from GraphQL spoke a few months back. So I'm not going to really talk too much about like what it is, but a really quick high level kind of understanding. Whereas both APIs, whether it's REST or GraphQL, is exposing your WordPress data, post pages, in our case, products, menus, etc. The difference between the two really quickly is that, GraphQL allows you to kind of cherry pick the data you want, right? Whereas REST, you kind of just, here's everything. And there's pros and cons to each. And I'm not going to get into the details of the pros and cons, kind of outside the scope. But what we're dealing with tonight is GraphQL, right? And so when we look at GraphQL, and by the way, GraphQL is another free plugin that you add to your WordPress site. And when you add it on, it turns your WordPress site into a GraphQL server per se. So we'll see how fast my local WordPress site behaves here, since I'm screen sharing and using resources. But yeah, it's a WP GraphQL free WordPress site, or free WordPress plugin that turns your site into a GraphQL server. The other plugin I'm using is WP GraphQL WooCommerce. That's also another free plugin that extends the GraphQL API and extends it and allows you to kind of extends the GraphQL API to add WooCommerce behavior into your API, right? So those are kind of the two kind of main plugins we're doing to kind of get started. But really quickly, in terms of kind of like what does the API look like? So if you're dealing with making queries, right? You can say, hey, here I want products. I want my first 3 products, and I'm going to get something called nodes. It's going to bring me an array of things, and I just want the name, and maybe I want the SKU of each of them. And I run that query. I think I run that query. There it goes. Cool. And then I get back the data that I asked for, right? In this case, I asked for the name and the SKU of my first 3 products, right? And I get back the first 3, and I get the data that I asked for, the title, and then the SKU for each of those, right? So that's kind of, GraphQL. Jason Ball kind of went over it, but in terms of WooCommerce, now I've got things like products available to me, right? Is this okay to read, by the way? Or is in terms of the font size and good stuff?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I'm on my laptop, which is really, really tiny, so it feels like it's going to be fine, but sometimes it's hard to tell when you're screen sharing.
That looks good.
Cool. All right, cool. So in terms of like, now we're kind of shifting over to, the Gatsby side of things, right? I've got this kind of Gatsby basic kind of starter site where I've got, just kind of, a navigation with a card and like the homepage. And right now I've just got placeholder stuff, right? So what I can do, if we switch over to the coding side of things, yeah. So Gatsby's written in React. It's a React framework. So I'm going to be doing a lot of Reacty stuff here. So most of, the rest of the talk is really going to be living in this layer here. And so what you'll notice is we're not going to be doing any PHP. A lot of the stuff is already exposed to us. now I am kind of outside of PHP and I'm in JavaScript land, more specifically React land. And if there's something weird that you don't kind of pick up, all good. You can always post a question. I'll try to answer it as best I can, right? So in terms of Gatsby, like if you want to make a query, const query, you export the const query, export const query. And we'll see how far I get with live coding. It's always fun. You have GraphQL. And so pretty much what you do is you are just going to somewhat copy this query that we just made here and bring it over into the Gatsby side of things, right? So we'll say query, let's just say all products, WP, and I'm just going to plop in what I wrote here. And if I go back here now, maybe. Wait for it.
We call this the Zoom effect at work. When you have
yeah, totally. Oh yeah, duh. So all I did was make the query, but I haven't gone up here and actually done anything with it. So it's still placeholder text. So if I change this, obviously that should change into that. So what I first need to do is take this data that's available to me. And now I have data and I have WP and I destructure it. I've got products and I've got nodes. And now instead of here, I'm just kind of mapping through this stuff in normal kind of React land. Nodes brings us back. Oops. Products, WP products, nodes. So then I got nodes and I map through there. Product, and I'm going to return product dot, let's just say slug as the key, and we'll say product dot name. We want to render out the name of each one of these guys, and hey, there we go. Cool. So there are my three. Let's make this a little more readable. Font size, let's just say extra large, and let's add a little margin bottom 10. Cool. So, okay, a lot of stuff happened there just to get our three things. But if we look at, kind of, yes, when we first did the query on the WordPress side of things, we had bean with logo, t-shirt logo, and then polo, right? And kind of we have that here, right? We're able to do that to kind of recapitulate by kind of mimicking that same query here, and then in the actual JSX, kind of, mapping through that and kind of rendering that out. Yeah. I'm going to take a break here, Brandon. We have any questions so far? I know it kind of went a little fast.
I've been answering a couple. Jason was asking about using SQL, raw SQL versus using GraphQL, like what the differences sort of are with GraphQL and SQL. And
cool.
I sort of have been updating along in the chat as we're growing here.
Cool.
But I think we're good on your end as far as the template structure, all that kind of stuff. I think we're good to go right now.
Sweet. Cool. So all we have here is kind of, this is a really contrived example, obviously, but we've got the homepage and we're literally just listing out, the first three products in my catalog, right? Like, cool. Normally this is going to be like a grid with an image and prices and, all these other things, right? But in our example here, it's like, okay, let's just list out the names of these products really quick to see kind of how this all plays together. But the neat thing is here, like I was able to write my query over to WordPress. and then just kind of map over it really nicely. So we're kind of making that connection initially, right?
And you can get that other data, right? The images that are coming from WooCommerce, like that's another thing that you could request from GraphQL.
Totally,
like all
totally.
those things are actually available to you with GraphQL and the WooCommerce extension as well.
Exactly. Yep. So I can have image, and let's just say in my UI, like maybe I just want the source URL, right? And then there we go, right?
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
So I believe there's also gallery, or is that a plugin? I forget. Yeah. Gallery images, right? So WooCommerce has a concept of having a gallery. So maybe I want the gallery. So I've got a collection of them, which is what nodes are, so on and so forth, right? But in my case, for our little example here, we're like, let's just get the name in the SKU, and we'd be good to go, as they say. So fine, that's catalog. That's kind of, the idea of like the archive page, right? But if we want to start looking at the single product page, just really start, getting a feel for like, add to cart and stuff like that, right? So in Gatsby, if you want to do routing, there's this concept of a link component, and we'll quickly talk about that. So in this case, I want to add like an A tag, if you will, right? And so I'm going to send it over to product, and then slash product.slug. Should work. Oops. So now product.slug is undefined. Did I not query slug? That's why I didn't query slug. So if I query the slug, now we should get, theoretically, probably need to refresh that. Product slug, that should work. Boom. Yes, that's awesome. What does this say? Undefined. I did something wrong. This name SKU slug, DDD, product slug. If you see something, Brandon, let me know, since you're the React expert.
Oh yeah, that's my world right there. No.
Did I not bring in a link? So link is in here. Cool. Beam, boom, boom. Product slug. Let me quickly look at my example. Name ID slug. Yeah, that looks right. Link to /product, product.slug, product.name. Let's just restart the server, huh? Why not? All things fail. I'll double check my typos and such. While that's loading up, I'll quickly talk about on the Gatsby side. There's this really cool API on on the Gatsby side called create pages, right? So if you remember, Gatsby is a static site generator, right? So it's going to generate all the product pages for us ahead of time at build time. But we have to kind of write some code to have it do that. And so basically the way this works is whenever Gatsby starts up, we'll kind of run through and expose this kind of hook, if you will. We'll make this query. We'll say, hey, go get me my first 3 products. And all I want is the slug. I'll do some quick checks or whatever. And then I'm going to loop over each product. And so for each product, I'm going to provide a path. And I'm going to say, hey, here's the file where you're going to kind of send it to. And then here's the kind of things I want you to send over. So that's kind of how like pages really quickly are created in Gatsby kind of ahead of time.
And this is a difference between sort of this is where Gatsby diverts from something like just a regular React app, right? Like you're not always fetching dynamic content. With Gatsby, a lot of what you're doing is pre-building those pages as static files rather than accessing things like via REST API or via GraphQL when you're clicking a link, right?
Totally. So these things are done ahead of time. So They're not done kind of on demand, like as the user is requiring them. And that, the pros on that is SEO is one thing, right? So by default, like let's just say you have 1,000 products, it's going to create ahead of time all these 1,000 HTML files. And so as opposed to kind of a typical React app where it's just one file and it kind of does things with JavaScript as the site loads. Some will argue that there are SEO limitations on that because it's really not the HTML that's rendered. It's just a kind of empty div, and then React kind of builds out the page. Hey, cool. So we got going.
Yeah. Before you get going, we have 2 questions real quick.
Yeah, for sure.
Torin is asking, sort of related to this, and he's curious what the advantages of Headless for Woo are and how you would handle sort of that interactivity, which I think might be coming later in your presentation. Yeah,
I think there are a lot of advantages, and I probably should have started with that, like why do this kind of thing?
Why torture yourself, Jacob?
So I think there are a lot of advantages of doing headless WooCommerce or just headless eCommerce, decoupled eCommerce, whatever way you want to call it. With WooCommerce, traditional WooCommerce development, at least for me, at Zeek, we do a lot of WordPress stuff and a lot of custom themes and plugins and stuff. When it came down to kind of WooCommerce, I was always really hesitant on doing too like much customizations because e-commerce, right? That's a person's livelihood, right? Now we're talking about, sales and money, right? As opposed to maybe a marketing site where there's about us or a membership site where, if something doesn't work, it may be problematic, but, you're not going to necessarily lose as much money. I don't know. For me, it felt that way. So, so my experience with kind of WooCommerce has always been, a kind of add-on kind of environment, right? So WooCommerce, the cool thing about WooCommerce, the empowering thing, I think, is that if you need some level of functionality, there's an add-on or extension for that. For instance, let's just say if you want to add Amazon Pay as one of your payment gateways, right? If you're not a developer, or maybe you are, but you just don't have the knowledge to like add that and build that, you can, either paid or free, get that, add that plugin, and now you've got Amazon Pay, right? And so that's, that's a functionality, but there's a lot of UI kind of add-ons as well that maybe you want a really cool, like carousel for your product page, or you want some really cool filtering. And so the challenge with that is performance and level of control, right? Because when you add some kind of like UI plugin, like a really cool carousel, you're subject to that author or that library's kind of architecture and how they wrote that thing or that combination of things, right? So maybe they're bringing in, 3 Google fonts, right? Or maybe they're bringing in some big JavaScript library. And so that's going to impact, I heard someone in the intro talk about, web metrics with Lighthouse and stuff, right? So that's going to impact possibly your performance in terms of your SEO scores. And so one of the advantages now, if you take away the UI from WordPress and you're building the UI yourself, you have a lot more control on how something is built, how performant it is, and things like that. So there is one reason of, just complete control over the UI. And the second is performance in terms of now, because you're building it, you can build it in a performant way, theoretically, right? I'm sure there's a bunch of other ones, but that's kind of the things that I think about.
And then sort of to that point as well, if you build it, you got to fix it if it's broken, right? Mm-hmm. So you get all the good, but you also get the responsibility of taking care of the application once it's out there and technologies are changing and all that kind of stuff. Which leads into Jason's other question is, when you're debugging, is there a way to step through different pieces in the code? Like when we do PHP development, we use Xdebug to do stepping through that. I'm sure there's a JavaScript sort of equivalent to something like that as you're developing. Is that something you're using?
Yeah. So there's the debugger, right? So there's a debugger keyword. Whenever you throw this on, and when the evaluator in the browser hits this keyword, it'll throw on the browser's version of Xdebug. I'm not going to run this because it's going to just jank up my stuff. There's good old console.log, right? Things like that. And then, when you're dealing with, kind of React, there's the React browser extension, right? That you can take a look at certain things. Index, yeah. And you can take a little, look at, things that you think should happen, or things like, in our case, data, like for some reason, let's just say like these 3 weren't showing up. And I'm like, I did my query right. Like what's going on here? I can really see as far as the props on this page, right? Index, which is the home page. I can see, okay, cool. There's data, there's WP, there's products, there's nodes. Cool. I've got each one of those. And maybe like, this was called like names, and I'm in my markup, I'm calling it name, like, oh crap. Yeah, it's names, right? So if I'm kind of debugging, that's one way in terms of why isn't my data showing up? Well, React knows about it, but for some reason it's not doing it here. Well, oh crap, this should be product.names instead of product.names, whatever the case may be, right?
So that would be a good place for you to look for the slug property that wasn't showing up before. Showing as undefined.
So like in this case, I've got 3 properties: name, SKU, and slug, right? If you were looking, I was trying to do product.slug, and for some reason that was coming back undefined. And if I was still stuck without realizing I didn't query for it here, I could have, one thing I could have done was go to the index, find out, what React has, and realize, oh, slug isn't there. Why isn't it there? Oh yeah, I didn't query for it, right?
Right. Okay, so the last question is, because you're generating a bunch of static pages ahead of time, what happens when you need to change a product? Like, how do you update that content?
Yeah, that's a great question. So normally in normal WordPress land, it's server-side render, you hit publish or you hit update, the next visitor that goes to the site, it's there. In this case, when you hit update or publish, Gatsby or React's not going to know about it. So it all depends on how you have your build system set up, right? So what happens is when you have your completed site, you send it over to a CDN. A really popular one is Netlify, right? And in terms of CI/CD, it'll kind of look at your GitHub repository, and if it sees a change on like a master branch, it'll kind of redeploy. What you can also do is a host like Netlify will expose a webhook that you can send a post request to. And every time a post request is sent to that'll trigger a build, right? And so what you can do is there's a few plugins out there in the market that will kind of build all that functionality for you. That will kind of look at, you can identify, look at taxonomies, look at products, and look at posts. And if there's ever a change, fire off that webhook to trigger the build. Or you can build it yourself when you kind of hook into like save post or whatever and right. Do it that way. So webhook, that's triggering it.
So it's not an instant like you're used to with WordPress. You click publish and magic, it's there. There is like a slight build time with the Gatsby system or any static file generator, basically, that it has to go through that process and build out that content.
Totally. And that's one of the trade-offs too, where you've got to rebuild the site for each time you make a change. Now there are some strategies out there like incremental builds that are becoming popular, where the CI/CD will look at your entire cache and realize, oh, you just updated, your Beanie post. Well, I'm not going to like rebuild the entire site. I'm just going to rebuild that one page, right? And so that's kind of out there too to help with that, especially as you start scaling. Maybe you got 5,000 products. Rebuilding a site can take you 20, 30 minutes, who knows? Yeah,
cool.
Totally.
All right, we'll leave it back over to you.
All right, cool. So let's get rid of this. So now, because I added that, and so now if I click into I can click into each one of those kind of single product pages, right? And so that's, if I click on Beanie with logo, and I see /product/Beanie with logo, right? And so right now I just kind of have placeholder. So let's kind of talk a little bit about like this single product page. Let's go here. Don't save. Product. Yeah. So if you notice, it's source templates and then product, and that should match with here, source templates product, right? This is kind of like the template, the product single, like if you're in WordPress theme land. Although in WooCommerce, I think it's named something different, but that's kind of where you're at. So for simplicity, I already pre-wrote this query since we kind of went over it in the previous example, but it's the same concept, right? A little different, but the same kind of idea where you're kind of querying some information on a given product, right? In this product, I want like the name, the slug, the database ID, and like the short description. This kind of weird slug :ID thing. All that means is, remember I talked about context here. When I'm creating each page, I am explicitly sending over this slug over to each page. And so that's how I'm able to pick it up here, the slug. And so I'm querying a product by its slug, right? If that makes any sense. Anyway, so I've got name, slug, database ID. And so we're back into kind of like template land here. If I do data, and if I do WP, should be product. And so now if I do product dot name, theoretically, placeholder should turn into beanie with logo. Hey, beanie with logo, cool. And so that'll work with t-shirt with logo, polo, so on and so forth, right? And when you, like Brandon was saying, when you eventually build out all these pages, this page will be pre-built ahead of time, right? It's not going to make a JavaScript request out to GraphQL at runtime. This is going to be done ahead of time as static HTML for something like that. So if I go back to, why don't I add more information? What else did we query? Short description. Now, short description, I am using TypeScript here, but short description is not always filled out, right? Because in a CMS, in a product, a user may not like fill out the short description field. So we kind of have to quickly check whether short description is available. Product.short description, and then render out HTML, and then render out the HTML because it comes in as product.short description. That should give us what we want. Cool. This is a simple product, I guess. All I did was I imported all the WooCommerce products that come with it, whatever. So I guess they keep it pretty simple in their descriptions. So really quickly, if like, what is this dangerously set inner HTML? If you look at how the data comes in from, what do we say, short description? If you look at how the data comes in from WordPress, it comes in as a HTML string, right? You've got the p tag, and then you got, I believe this is line break. I believe so. I forget.
Yeah.
So if I just take this as a string, it's not going to treat this p tag as a paragraph. It's literally going to write out this thing on the DOM. So I need to parse this and treat it as HTML. And that's what this does here in React. So it's just, I think they purposely said like, be really, really careful what you're doing here, because there's cross-site scripting potential. But I know my admins are not putting any bad strings here, so we can be kind of safe with something like this. Anyway, so yeah, so we got simple product. Let's talk about add to cart, right? We've been talking a good 30, 40 minutes. We haven't done any, eCommerce stuff yet. We just been kind of templating stuff out, right? So with add to cart, I have an add to cart component. So let's spit that out first, and we'll break down kind of what's happening. And I already got an error saying product ID is missing. That's right. So that's add to cart component is expecting the product ID, and that's available via product dot, I believe, database ID. Yeah, database ID. So let's go into this component really quick and kind of break down what we want to do. So if I click on it, I just got an alert, add to cart. So with WooCommerce, right? Like there is a mutation that we have available to us called add to cart. And so we kind of have to use that mutation to kind of do what we need to do. Add to cart. Did Jason really talk about mutations that much? I can quickly go over.
Really very much.
Okay, cool. I can talk about it briefly. So in GraphQL, there are queries and then there are mutations. Queries is like reading data, consuming data. Mutations is that you're kind of writing data, like writing to a database, mutating data, changing data, right? And so a lot of times mutations involve some level of authentication, right? So if you look at the list of mutations here, there's like create order, create post format, delete order, right? These are all kind of, actions that you're taking against your WordPress site, whether it's WooCommerce or not, like update page, update post, things like that. In our case, we're going to be adding to cart, and that is a mutation. And so mutation expects a few pieces of data. It expects the product ID, meaning what are you adding to your cart, right? And then things like quantity, maybe you want to add one thing. And so we'll kind of live in these two kind of variables. We'll say when we add to cart, we're going to send along the product ID, and we're going to send along how many things of that thing you're going to add. And the cool thing is with a mutation, you can get data back on the same request, right? So we can add to cart, and then we can get information about the cart right in the same response, right? So maybe I want to get the subtotal, tax, total, I want contents, I want how many items are in the cart, and then for each one, I want to get the products that are in the cart, and then I want to get the name of the product, right? Going pretty quickly there, but the gist is, right, you can add to the cart, you can send along the ID of the product that you're adding along with the quantity. And then in the same request, you'll say, hey, add to cart, but when you bring me stuff back, I want the cart information back to me, right? And the cool thing about GraphQL is maybe your e-commerce store is, unique in the sense of like, you don't do subtotal tax, right? Like all you do is subtotal and total, and maybe you don't even list the products. I don't know, right? So the cool thing is you can cherry pick the data that you want back. Whereas like with the REST environment, like you're subject to, they'll just dump all this data to you, and you just kind of have to filter through and deal with what you want. So this keeps the kind of payload as light as possible, I think, and gives you a lot of control with the data that you're requesting and stuff like that. So this is kind of a big step here, right? The add to cart, you're sending the product ID and you're kind of doing stuff. So let's see if it works for us, right? So here's what I have, right? So I have a button and I've got an on-click handler that says, when you click, run this function. And then for right now, all I'm doing is just doing an alert to add to cart. I think I need to, give me 1 second. Let me look at my notes just to make sure I keep this as smooth as possible since we're live coding really quick. Okay, so a couple things. This is going to be, I guess you can say an XHR AJAX request, right? The difference is, we're not using like jQuery or anything like that to make an AJAX request or the Fetch API. We're using something called Apollo. And so Apollo is an HTTP GraphQL library, right? It makes making runtime GraphQL requests easier, right? The downfall to it, many say that it's really, really big. And if you look, my ID's like red here, and it says, yo dog, you've got a pretty big package that you're bringing on here. But for our example, it gets the job done. You can use things like the Fetch API if you want Axios or whatever the case may be. But I think the important thing that we're kind of understanding here is we're making a kind of XHR AJAX request with our mutation as the query. So the nice thing is it exposes a React hook called use mutation. And actually first, let's bring in the mutation before we kind of get into that. And I already have it pre-written just to save us some time. And so this is it here, right? So it's very similar to kind of what I demoed. We've got a mutation. I called it add to cart, and here it is, add to cart. Here's the cart we're going to get back, subtotal. It's really similar to kind of what I was doing here, right? Mutation, ATC, right? And it just kind of mimics that. So to save us some time, I kind of just pre-wrote it ahead of time. And we'll talk about some of these things like the inputs and like, how does this get there and stuff like that. But pretty much I'm adding to cart and I'm getting the cart back, right? I get some totals and I get the products back, like SKU and then the price or whatever. And so when I write the mutation, the very first parameter that I pass is the mutation that I want to run. In our case, we want that add to cart mutation. And then I get back an array. And I can destructure that array. And the very first thing in the array is a function that we want to create, and we can call it whatever we want. But this is the function that's actually going to be running. So we can call this add to cart. And the next thing I get is a set of parameters. But in our case, the only thing I need is loading. We'll talk about kind of what this means. And so now instead of alert, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to run my function that I just created, add to cart, which is this guy right here. And I'm going to pass in some parameters. Well, if we think about the parameters, we talked about two parameters that we want to pass in. We said we want to pass in the product ID and then the quantity. And so that's kind of what we're going to pass in. We're going to say input product ID. And product ID is what? Well, product ID we already have available as passed in as a prop. So we're good there. Actually, this is called variables. Then we do input. Then we say we're going to send over the product ID. Then we're going to say quantity. Let's just say we only want to add 1. Cool. So this looks good. Shall we like run it and see what happens? Why not, right? Oh, really cool. So on the button, I have an is loading prop, is loading. And I will set that to the value of loading. And all this is just kind of really cool UI. If I do is loading is true, if I go back to my page here, now you see that little spinner happen in there, right? So I'm going to set is loading to the value of loading. And what Apollo does for me nicely is as soon as this, by default, is set to false, right? Loading is a Boolean that comes back to us. But the neat thing is when I run this function, loading is reactive to that. So it'll by default, it'll be set to true. And when this function resolves, it'll be set to false. So it kind of handles the loading, not loading state for me, right? So anyway, did I not save this? Probably not. This here, and let's open up our XHR and see what happens. Usually the first time I run it takes a second or two. For some reason, my local WordPress is a little off, but cool. Well, something happened because it stopped loading. I don't see any errors. And if we look at this post request, we'll look at our request really, really quickly. The operation name is ATC, which is this right here. Cool. We passed in some variables like the product ID. In this case, it happened to be 40. We said we want 1. And if we look at the response, hey, we got something, right? So it says, cool, we got a subtotal of $18, $24 total. I guess I have some shipping. There's 1 item in my cart, and it should be, yep, beanie with logo. So I'll pause there for a second. If Brandon, if you have any questions that are coming up in the chat.
That was pretty magical.
What's that?
That was pretty magical. You made it work the first time.
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty crazy.
No, let's see. I think the other questions we're going to talk about at the end because they're not super related to what you're talking about.
Cool. So I can walk us through a little bit of kind of what's happening here too, right? Like, how did this like happen, kind of thing, right? Behind the scenes and things like that, and some other things. But yeah, so we sent in the mutation, via this product ID that got loaded into this component that we passed over right from the template, right? So from this single product template, if you will, into this add to cart component, we passed in this product's ID. In the add to cart component itself, we have our button here that says add to cart. And then on click, we said, go ahead and run this function, handle add to cart, which is pretty much a wrapper for this other function that Apollo has available to us that runs our mutation, which is add to cart here. Right. So all these things are kind of connecting. But as Brandon was saying earlier on, like if we talked about like what are the trade-offs of like building something headless in WooCommerce, right? If you're seeing like there's a lot of things that are kind of connecting here, and this is such a critical part of an e-commerce experience, right? Someone, everyone, like all the marketers talk about like conversion and stuff like that. Like, so when someone finally says add to cart, like that cart button better work, right? And so if you think about like all these things that are coming into place, right? Like you're building this, so it needs to work, right? And so there's a lot happening here, but to me, it's pretty exciting. It's pretty cool stuff that's going on here. So if we look at the top here, like we've got this cart, in the header of like 0, like I can quickly talk about like how to update that. And then we can take a look at like some other things besides that.
You got this response back from the server, right? Because you sent a request out. Like this is one of those cases where this is a real-time functionality. It's not a pre-built cart. You have not made a cart for every possible combination of things that you could possibly order, right? Like this is something that happens dynamically. So where is this being stored? You've got data somewhere in between this static land and in the WordPress land. Where does that live?
So on the WordPress side of things, WooCommerce has a session environment, right? So WooCommerce stores every cart in a session in its database. It's persisted in the database, meaning that each person's cart is saved. I think it's a 2-day session, if I'm mistaken. But it has a unique identifier and it has all this data saved in it, right? So on the one hand, it's saved in WordPress. So every time someone adds something to their cart on your WooCommerce store, that is a database entry that's happening on your WooCommerce store. It's in its own table, so it's kind of, I think, optimized as best it can be. That's getting into deeper PHP Brandon land, I think. So on the one hand, it's stored in WooCommerce, persisted in the database, right? And then on the second hand here on the UI layer, like where is it stored? The answer is like it can be stored in any way you want it to be, right? Because you're responsible for the UI here, you can store it in something called local storage, right? You can store it in something called global state, which is whether you want to do like Redux or something called context. And I'll quickly talk, I'm going to show something called context. Because what you want to be able to do is when someone adds something else to the cart, right? You want it to append, and now you have 2 items in the cart. And then you want it to like show up here, like the number 2 in your cart, right? And so did that answer your question, Brandon?
Yeah. And I think just to touch on what Jason's talking about in the chat is the entries get stored in the database, first of all, because, as an e-commerce owner, you want to know who's putting things in their cart so that you can go, hey, you forgot that thing in your cart. Don't you want to buy that before it's all sold out? Right. Those are the things that you get 2 days later or whenever that expiry time happens. But those databases, I think it's configurable how long that can stay in the database. Sometimes they'll just like, yeah, I want to know what people are storing and not buying. Right. Mm-hmm. And you can actively go and delete those things in the session. Like there are add-ons for WooCommerce to allow you to see those things that are sort of in there. it's not something you really need to worry about because it is in a separate table. It's not, pulling on your database and slowing down your site because you have people who have a lot of things in their cart. But if you want to, you can clean those up as necessary.
Yeah. If we look at the request, right? This was a post request. This is an XHR request. This is nothing like, React or, Apollo or mutation, GraphQL land. This is straight up native XHR Ajax request going over, right? The only difference is like, the actual queries wrapped in a string and nicely for us and packed and sent along with our variables that we did, right? But if we look at the headers really quickly, one thing is the way that Woo GraphQL handles sessions is different than the way WooCommerce kind of vanilla WooCommerce does, right? Because traditionally, WooCommerce does sessions via cookies. Because you're in the same domain, whenever you add to cart, the page sometimes refreshes. Depends on your WooCommerce setup, I think. You can have like inline, but it'll respond back with a set cookie header, and every time you make a subsequent request, that cookie's sent along so that it knows, oh yeah, your cart session 1, 2, 3. Here's your thing, right? But the difference here with Woo GraphQL is because we're not in a cookie-based environment, because we're on different domains and things like that, it sends the session back in a header called WooCommerce session, right? And so you get this really long string of like, what is this stuff? But this is a JSON web token. And so you can take a look at this and you can, So a JSON web token, if we encode or decode it rather, it's got 3 parts. It's got a header to it, but what's important to us, it's got a payload with data, and it's got all this weird stuff here. But most importantly, it's got this data customer ID, and this is the session inside of WooCommerce that's stored in the database as the session key, right? So with this, this is kind of all packed in nicely and kind of put in this thing, but this is the actual session that WooCommerce saves in the database and sends along back as the response header. And why that's important is when we send a subsequent request, we need to send over this session along as a header as well, because otherwise WooCommerce has no idea that Brandon already has a t-shirt in his cart. Now he wants to add a beanie. Otherwise it's, oh, I don't know who you are. Let me just add a beanie and that's it, right? And so I can quickly talk about at a very high level kind of what that looks like. And so I talked about Apollo. And one of the cool things about Apollo is that it allows you to, among other things, got some really cool caching, but it allows you to leverage a lot of this HTTP management and facilitate it for you nicely. So there's this concept of like middleware and afterware. So one thing that you can facilitate is you can kind of catch the incoming token as it comes in and then store it in local storage for future requests, right? And so at a very high level, what that looks like is, right, in here, this was a response header, right? This is what the server is sending back to me on the client, right? And it's bringing back where was it? Yeah, it's returning this WooCommerce session to me nicely. So all I need to do on the Apollo level is literally say, hey, headers.get WooCommerce session, right? Cool. Well, if there's no session sent, like get out of this particular function that's running. If we already have one, right, return. But if we don't have one, all I'm doing in my case is setting a local storage that WooCommerce session and calling it Woo session. So what I can do really quickly is I can go to my storage here and I can go to local storage, local host, and I should have, there's my Woo session. And that's the Woo session that I'm saving locally. And why that's important is that's on the incoming. Now on the outgoing, what I'm doing is kind of the same thing. Every time there's a HTTP request, right, like a mutation or a query, I am getting the Woo session from local storage, right, which is this. And if there's a session, I'm adding it to the headers as WooCommerce session. And this is the way that WooCommerce expects it, right? Session, and then the actual session that's being sent along, right? So that is that is the meat of what's facilitating when I add a subsequent item to the cart, right? WooCommerce is looking for that session key inside of this WooCommerce session header, and it returns it back to me inside of the same thing, WooCommerce session. So back and forth, headers back and forth is kind of what's happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I know that's a lot.
That's great. No, that's good.
So that's what's important, because traditionally you're in cookie land, and all that stuff's kind of happening for you in WordPress WooCommerce land. But in a headless environment, we need to explicitly look for these headers that WooCommerce is sending, and we need to send it along with our request so that WooCommerce knows, oh, cool, this is Brandon, and Brandon already has a cart and he already has a t-shirt. Let me add this that beanie that he wants for that. Cool. How are we doing on time? It's 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, you keep going, man. You're doing great.
Let me show you really quickly just this kind of, updating this cart, right? And then at a very high level, I'll show you checkout. And I think that should be good for more questions or whatever. Because I know this is a lot of information. Anyway, so where were we? Add to cart? Yeah. So whether you did or you didn't, I have this kind of use app state function or a hook that's kind of hanging around here. That is something called context at a very high level. All that is global state, meaning my entire application is wrapped around this kind of wrapper, if you will. And at any time, any component can consume data from it. And in my case, if I go into app state, the only two pieces of data that I have is the cart and a function that sets the cart, right? And so if I look at the type of cart, I don't know, do you see this blow up bubble? Sometimes it does. Does it come through? Yeah.
Yeah, it's showing up.
Okay, cool. In terms of like, what is it? Well, this is our cart, right? Subtotal, total, shipping, contents, right? So that's a type, or it could be, undefined as well, because not every user has a cart or every site visitor. So without getting too much into the weeds of like context and stuff like that, just think about it as global state, right? So I can destructure set cart from it. And so the really cool thing about Apollo is that another option or another thing that's available to me, I believe it's called uncompleted. Did I forget the name of it? One sec. Add to cart. Yeah, uncompleted. Cool. Yep. Set cart. Yeah. Oh, I know what it is. Okay, so it's not here, but in the mutation. Cool. So in the mutation, Apollo exposes an uncompleted function, which pretty much says, when you're done, right, do something. In my case, what we want to do is, when we get the cart back, we want to update this cart count to reflect what the user's cart is. So the cool thing is we have on the completed, we have the add to cart data available to us. So all we need to do is we set cart, run our set cart function to add to cart dot cart. Right? So where does this add to cart come from, and what is dot cart? Well, add to cart is right here. This is add to cart. And then all we want is we need to pass over all the values, which is the dot cart object, right? And so that should be it. Let's see. I already have beanie in my logo, so let's add t-shirt, add to cart. That should show too when it's fulfilled. Let's see what happens. Inspector, console. Hey, cool, we got two. And so if we look at the post request again, we look at the response, yeah, item count 2, right? And so if we look at that component, the header, like where is that getting its data from? Well, we got that same use app state, but in this case, I don't want the set cart. I just want to get cart, right? And cart, if you see there on TypeScript, either returns the cart type or undefined. And so all I simply need to do is get cart.contents of item count or fall back to 0, right? Whew, mouthful. Margowski's loving it, yeah.
He's on his like 10th pixie stick.
Yeah. Very cool. So that is kind of really at a really fast pace, like, the context and like updating, that cart page, or that cart little count here. The neat thing is if I go to cart now, yeah. So the neat thing, because I've stored cart in state, I think, if I go to components and if I go to cart, maybe not. Components, probably not. I don't know, it's 8:15. I think I'll quickly talk about checkout instead of cart page, because the cart page is pretty straightforward now because we already have cart available to us in state. Then it's just a matter of getting the information. This can get pretty lengthy. Let's quickly talk about checkout. Checkout is really, really hard because we're dealing with payment gateways, right? We're dealing with, if I go to checkout here, yeah, cool. So I built this out already, and I can walk through kind of like what's happening here, but let's see if it actually works. 4242, and I can put in whatever 1, 2, 3, 4, and let's pay, and see what happens. I wrote a blog post about this because WooCommerce doesn't have this concept of like a hosted checkout, right? So a lot of the newer, hey, cool, thank you, your order was received, $42, and here's what I bought. Cool. So we'll talk about that really quick, but let's quickly see if what happened. Let's make sure that our order, I see one order. So 25 seconds ago, George Costanza, and there's my beanie with logo, right? And that came in through Stripe, right? And then stock levels reduced, right? This WooCommerce doesn't know anything about like where this came from, right? It thinks like, all right, cool. You got an order. I placed the order. All is good. It just so happened that this happened from a decoupled Gatsby React application or your native iPhone app or whatever. It took the order, right? Because we sent the order along. It's got billing information, status processing, shipping information. It's got its Stripe fee. Like this, if you were to look at this, you have no idea this came from Gatsby, right? And so let's talk about checkout, right? So I'm using Stripe here. And so Stripe is a free, I think it's a free plugin. And it's an add-on for WooCommerce. I believe it's called, WooCommerce Stripe Gateway. It's a free plugin. It pretty much turns on Stripe on your WooCommerce site. But so I wrote a blog post called Headless WooCommerce Checkout with Gatsby and Stripe, right? And so the neat thing is, and I guess I can post this to Brandon after, you can kind of read it on your own. But if we kind of take a look at the checkout page to like figure out what's going on. Checkout. Yeah, cool. Okay, so fine. I have this checkout page and then I've got this like elements and then checkout form. A couple things that are happening here. We have a couple libraries that we're using, the Stripe React library and the Stripe just library as well, right? The Stripe library has this kind of load Stripe function that's available to us. We pass in our Stripe API public key, right? This kind of makes that connection over to Stripe. And then we wrap over our form with this kind of elements component that the React library has for us, right? And then we pass in our Stripe here. So that's kind of the skeleton. If we look at the actual form itself, a lot of magic happening, but we'll kind of walk through really quickly at a high level. It exposes this card element. So this card element is pretty much all the credit card information. All we want to do is we want to hide the postal code because it's, for some reason, shows by default. And I applied some base styles. But on this form, when you submit, it'll run this handle submit function, which is this gal. And then we run this handle Stripe function, and all that does, we have the Stripe create source function available to us, right? And so if you're familiar with Stripe, you know that source, from the way I understand it, is kind of an entry that's happening on the Stripe side of things. It returns you back an ID because Stripe stores all the credit card information. And so you get that ID back from source. And then you have this mutation called checkout. You pass in over variables, which is really similar to like the add to cart. But more importantly, on the metadata, you pass over a key called Stripe source ID, and you send along that ID of that Stripe that you sent over. For simplicity reasons, I'm just hard coding the billing information, right? Typically on a UI, you would put in all like first name, last name, and all the fields and stuff. But here, I just hard coded it for our example, right? And the neat thing is, like, because we're using use mutation, just like we did before, we have this uncompleted. I'm running this handle successful checkout function that pretty much says, navigate to this order received page and send along my order, right? And so order received gets order from location.state. And then now I'm just kind of in React templating land, right? I've got order number, total, which is what we have here. Order number, total, so on and so forth, right? So I know that was really fast, but at a very high level, that's kind of what's going on with Stripe and checkout there. So I think I'll pause now, Brandon, for some questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the feedback Tom had mentioned is like it's really cool, like the things that you're able to do here, but it seems like a ton of rewriting and writing from scratch, like every time you write, a custom application like this. I mean, yes, I think you would agree with that for sure. And this isn't an approach that any blog would need to take, right? Like headless WordPress is not a common use case. It's probably becoming more common, but it's not something that everyone should run out to do just because it's something that we're talking about. It's a use case for a number of things, but it's going to require more code writing, more responsibility, more maintenance on your end. And it's, yeah, exactly right, Tom. It's not for your $500 budget clients.
No, definitely not. So for the project I did over the summer, it was for a client. It's called Rudis.com. So this is shipped already. This is public. This is an example of a headless WordPress WooCommerce site that's running with Gatsby hosted on Netlify. And so this is, you go on here, right? You've got colors, boom, add to cart. So it starts to get kind of zippy. You're now you got your cart page. You want to update whatever, right? So now you got 4, you go back, so on and so forth. If you want to go to t-shirts and tops, now you've got some filtering built in if you want to do filtering, right? This, allows you to, open up the realms of, the UI, right? Because when you're in traditional WooCommerce land, a lot of stuff is really, really possible, but like I was saying at the beginning, you may be limited by, now you're tacking on all these different add-ons and plugins, and each one does their thing specifically. And maybe it's not a performant way, and the client wants something that looks like Nike.com, but we can't really do that because that plugin doesn't really allow it. And now you start ripping apart WooCommerce templates, and then to update WooCommerce becomes crazy town, right? And so that's the trade-off. Like, okay, cool, let's just ditch WooCommerce for the UI layer. Let's just do the UI layer ourselves. But as you can see, like doing it, here, you are starting from scratch. Like you are responsible for building out the add to cart. But I think the takeaway tonight is like, it is possible if you want to do it. Like the tools are there. But yes, you have to build it yourself. You have to maintain it, right? You have to learn about like running tests and stuff like that. But like, just think about like checkout, right? There's so much that goes involved with checkout, right? All the user information, error handling, validation, you got to do it yourself. But it's possible. I mean, we ship this, it's cool. It's happening,
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that's really sort of nice to see is that over the however many months we've been doing this now, each month we're seeing sort of a different aspect of all these things, right? Like we started with Jason. He talked about, GraphQL sort of under the hood technology. We talked about sort of the React and Next.js kinds of things if you're building up from scratch. But we also saw from Frontity last month, I think it was last month, where they have a React framework pre-built that does a lot of great things out of the box. It may not handle WooCommerce at this point, but it may sometime in the future. And so as this becomes more and more accessible, I think you'll start seeing faster and faster sites with more complicated use cases, but a transition from, being sort of WordPress PHP developers to maybe more WordPress JavaScript developers or things like that as people are starting to move in this decoupled way here.
Yeah, because I didn't talk about any PHP tonight at all, right? The only thing I did was turn on a couple of GraphQL plugins and I was done with WordPress, right? I'm now in React land. And so, but you don't have to be a JavaScript developer. Maybe you want to build it in just plain HTML and kind of do everything with like Ajax and stuff. That's cool too. I think something like Gatsby brings to the table a lot of these tools that make a lot of the static sites very performant.
That's awesome. I think there's a couple questions that are related to kind of what you're talking about, as well as some additional things that maybe you might have some things to talk about, but we also have some folks who can maybe touch on too.
Sure. Do you want me to still share, or did you want to take over?
I don't need to share anything, but if you want to stop sharing, that's totally fine.
Cool. Last thing is I have this project up on GitHub. So if you want to go back and take a look at it and kind of at your own time over some tea, I have two branches, the completed one. And if you want to start from scratch, you can go to the start branch and have fun with it and try to build it yourself. So I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, if you want to, you can either post it on meetup.com or you can just send it to me on Slack and then I'll get it up with the video later.
Cool. Does it have to be tea, Jacob?
It could be coffee, whatever you want.
It can be with pixie sticks, Dave. Whatever. Okay, so Tom was asking if, and this I think is a good one to transition from, is can you talk about the difference between doing sort of a dynamic application versus a purely static site in Gatsby? How do the approaches differ in that sense if you're using a content management system or just a static site?
Yeah, I think, a static site purely is just, a bunch of HTML files that are sitting on a CDN somewhere, right? And that could be Netlify, it can be AWS, Azure. I know there's some Azure peeps in the house. And so all it is, think of it, very typical kind of brochure marketing site, right? Your corporate site, home, about us, contact us, right? It's really not much interaction happening. It's just text. And so that's kind of a lot where I think static site generators really kind of shine, is you don't necessarily have to be making database queries on each request. Yes, of course, your really good hosts have object caching involved and page caching involved. So there's caching layers involved on certain things. And but if it's a about us page that's maybe updated once every 6 months, let's just build it ahead of time. And so when a user comes in, it's globally available in a CDN. So if they're in Europe, maybe that CDNs are in Europe and stuff like that. Now the dynamic part comes in where you're mixing that pre-built HTML page with add to cart, right? Because with add to cart, if you remember, we clicked on add to cart, that was making a runtime, meaning happening on the fly request from that HTML file over to your WordPress site. And then getting data back, right? So there's that dynamic aspect of it where, yes, just because it's an HTML file, you're in React land, you can make those runtime requests for like add to cart, things like inventory checks, right? Whatever the case may be, or like the cart page or checkout, right? All kinds of cool things. So you can definitely, just because you're in static site, doesn't necessarily mean that you're only subject to static content.
Cool. Okay, so talking about WooCommerce a little bit, and you guys do a decent amount of WooCommerce sites here and there.
Yeah.
Do you guys? Jason was asking early on if you guys are experiencing any of the sort, and this may be more of like Aaron's world or whatever, but how WooCommerce violates OWASP rules. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that at all.
I don't know what that is. Oauth?
And
What is that?
yeah, and Jason, feel free to jump in. You can unmute yourself and sort of pose your question as it may make sense.
Sure. So what I mean by OWASP is Web Application Firewall, and that's so basically my wife has a e-commerce store using WooCommerce and WordPress, and a lot of websites these days are getting breached, and I don't want her to be a victim. So as a result, I'm cranking up security, and I just turned on the OWASP default rule set on Azure CDN Web Application Firewall. And it's essentially, when it violates the rules, I just basically display a page that says nothing here. So it's happening.
OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project. It's a nonprofit foundation that's
correct.
Involved in security.
Correct. So I'm finding that I have to disable, I would probably say maybe 6 or 7 rules or so in order for it to work properly, or it's going to start blocking stuff, that it's not supposed to block. For example, my wife uses Stripe as well, and it does an asynchronous call for the credit card information. Well, that runs right into the OWASP rules, and it just doesn't work if I leave the rule turned on rather. But at the same time, if I turn it off, my concern is cross-site scripting problems.
Sure. Yeah, and I will say, and Jacob, feel free to jump in, but anytime you're having to build your own system, like what Jacob's kind of showing, the onus of security is 100% on you. Dealing with the session that's going back and forth to WooCommerce, like there may be some additional consideration in a production environment that you want to have versus something that you're just playing around on a local install. Making sure that those transactions are all happening over SSL, making sure that you're trusting the sources for any embedded scripts that are coming in, things like that. You're probably doing less dangerously setting HTML than really being thoughtful about the kinds of HTML you are allowing in. So in this sort of decoupled environment, you're taking all that responsibility on yourself. And it is possible with WooCommerce, like just out of the box default, that there are going to be security issues. Typically, like a free plugin that's out there, like you're going to run into something. So it's good that you have a security mind in place on that, and just have to set some tolerances for what you're willing to let go of, or what makes sense for you. If we're talking about $50,000 products, you're probably going to be a lot more security focused than a $10 product or something like that. But I would say like OWASP was, I think one of the original members of OWASP was one of the owners of Securi. They're one of sort of the Orange County WordPress group's friends. Like Dre Armeda is down here in Orange County, Inland Empire area, and his business partner over there was one of the founding members over there. So I definitely know that the WordPress space has security experts. That's definitely not my like deep expertise, but I know that is, and possibly here in the group too, if there are any security experts, please speak up. But I would definitely, consult other experts like yourself to find out some more information about those specific kinds of rules.
All right, cool. Thank you.
I would also say that one can argue that because you've decoupled your WordPress instance, right? The UI is now public, and theoretically your WordPress site is no longer publicly accessible, that could be a possible security strategy as well, right? So maybe you lock down your WordPress site because it's no longer responsible for delivering content. It's just your CMS, right? So you're limiting possibly, your actual WordPress site from getting hacked and things like that. So by going decoupled, some argue that that's actually a plus on the security side, because no longer is your WordPress site kind of susceptible to any attacks, because perhaps you want to like put that behind some kind of authentication layer that only maybe your Gatsby app has access to and things like that.
Yeah, because I can tell you, as far as like the website, the WordPress backend, I actually secure that through a dual two-factor authentication. Sweet. So that's okay. It's just I'm just concerned about SQL injection and everything else on the front end, and people taking over the server. I really don't want PCI knocking down the door and say, "Here's a fine because we got to replace this many credit cards."
Sure, and definitely in terms of that, like if you're using Stripe, that's actually a good thing, because you're offloading a lot of that storage of credit cards to their system, and you're just embedding their payment form either by JavaScript or in an iframe or something like that. So it's a better system as far as PCI is concerned. But I think the good thing is you're thinking about it, right? Like a lot of people who just set up a site and they're like, yeah, I'm selling all sorts of things, I got my side hustle, and then suddenly they're in trouble because they're not paying attention to what they're storing, either credit cards or just personally identifiable information, right? They get hacked and suddenly people's addresses are exposed or whatever. So securing the WordPress side of things is definitely a good place to start.
One of the things actually I found that in securing the WordPress site is when I put it behind the CDN that interacts with the web application firewall, is that it breaks certain things. Like for example, the web server, the web server, I believe Apache actually has its own, direct address, and sometimes WooCommerce references that one instead of the actual home URL. So therefore, it's completely bypassing the CDN. And the way I have it actually set up is that I'm blocking everything that bypasses the CDN. So therefore, it breaks certain things. Mm-hmm. So now I'm trying to go through the code and trying to fix it when the problem is I don't know PHP. Mm-hmm. That's the problem. That's the hard part.
Yeah, and I think the thing you want to watch out for too, and I think somebody mentioned it. I think it may have been Jacob, but like when you're dealing with some of those plugins, like if you're having to sort of scan through some of those things and change any of that code, you run into the issue of how are you going to update that if you've modified that plugin or something like that, right? Like the best thing you can do is, if you know what the issue is, especially with a plugin like WooCommerce that has a company like Automatic behind it, is either write the code yourself if you know how to, and submit a pull request because it's open source, it's on GitHub. You can find it there and do that, or at least posing that into their support channels, so that you can, as more of an IT professional, security expert, you can then give them that information from that perspective, so that they can start going, okay, maybe we're making this call in a weird way or whatever, and they have a team of developers who are working on WooCommerce to be able to jump in and fix something like that. And you're then not worrying about maintaining your updates to the plugin yourself. You're actually contributing that back to the community, and you're benefiting from that as well. So that would probably be the preferred way as sort of WordPress goes to manage issues like that.
Thank you. I think I'll do that. I'll reach out to them. That way, I'm not stuck trying to maintain stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And again, like that's one of the things with decoupling your website, right? Like you are, and then the entire workforce of maintaining your website, like integrating any plugin into a headless environment is a challenge, because you have to build that integration. Whether it's WooCommerce, whether it's Yoast SEO, whether it's whatever, plugins don't typically work with a decoupled setup out of the box, like period. So you have to sort of build that integration yourself.
Thank you.
Sure. On the topic of security, John D had mentioned early on about application passwords being a thing now in WordPress core. Do you want to talk about that, John?
Yeah, so the new update is application passwords, which is just like the JWT web tokens that we were discussing with this application. And I guess it's a complete clusterfuck right now. I don't know if anybody's noticed in your users section, there's like a new applications password. There's multiple security flaws with it. They may take it down, but it'll probably go up and stay up eventually. And it's basically going to be the way to do this, like the official way. And it's a way that you can generate basically a code, and then your headless application can access your WordPress install as that user. And you've probably seen these things like Oauth, where they says log into Google with your, and then you don't have to give them your Google password. So that's a new thing. I was just wondering if any of you guys had used it yet, or what your experience with it was.
I have not personally used it yet. I know that Oauth and WordPress has been a thing that they've been talking about for as long as I can remember. It's something that is really tricky in WordPress, because if you have a publicly available plugin that uses Oauth in some way, to Oauth to an individual site, if that site is compromised, all of those connections that are connected to that site then become targets and exposed as well. So I know it's a problem they've been trying to solve for a long time, that being the core team and all the volunteers for the project. But I have not personally used it yet, or had a need to use it at this point.
I haven't used it either. I started playing around with it, trying to see if there was a method that was exposed that where I can send along credentials and then generate that programmatically. I didn't see that. It feels as though each user needs to go into their WordPress admin and like create it themselves.
No,
that's the flow that I saw initially.
You can.
Oh, you can. Okay. I do know that GraphQL, the WP GraphQL plugin supports application passwords. So if you want to make authenticated requests with that token, you can.
It's basically the graph thing that you're doing is the same exact thing. It's just a whole separate framework. The functionality is the same. It seems like you can do the same sorts of things with it. Would you say that's accurate, or?
I mean, from what I understand, like, again, it's sort of what Jacob's talking about is the authenticator request. I mean, since the REST API has been in WordPress core, they've been struggling with a way to have authenticated requests, right? So being able to, let's say you have a membership site that's a decoupled sort of membership site. You want to be able to have people log in and get authenticated access to content that is protected otherwise. Again, just one use case, but without something like that, where you can have somebody make that request on their behalf without having, I mean, you can use cookies, and that's basically sort of the way that a lot of them work right now. But that's one way to authenticate those requests, to make sure that each individual user is making requests that are authenticated for themselves. So I imagine it will continue to iterate over time and become better, but it's not the only thing that's broken into a WordPress release. Over the years, there have been several things that have gotten put in and pulled out at some point. So,
well, I think they're definitely going to be able to fix it. It'll just be basically the WordPress version of Oauth, and it's here now. So start using it.
Yep. Cool.
Oh, how do you handle accounts with the WooCommerce site that you have? Is it the same kind of thing, or are you just using the GraphQL API, or
you can approach it a couple? Yeah, you can approach it a couple different ways. For that Rootis project I was showing that's in production, we've taken a hybrid approach. So we let WordPress handle checkout and all the authenticated my account stuff. because, I think partly it was budget and partly it was timeline too, like to do all that stuff, like Brandon was saying, that's a whole nother layer, right? Because now you've got to, manage authentication. And there are tools out there, but, it's a lot, and it's a lot of work to maintain. So if you're looking to do it like on the GraphQL pure client side layer, there's a JSON web token plugin that pretty much works. You send along your user's credentials, username and password. WordPress will then check, like, is this person who they say they are? And if they are, it'll send you back a short-lived token, usually like 5 minutes or something like that, along with another token that allows you to reactivate the short-lived token, right? And so on each request, you send along that short-lived token, and WordPress will check that token to see if you are who you say you are, right? So it's just tokens going across.
But you're currently you're just having them go into WordPress for all the My Account stuff right now?
Yeah. So if someone buys something and it says, view my orders, we send them to the WordPress domain.
Gotcha. Okay.
For now, we're eventually going to probably just migrate that all over to the client side of things, but we're doing some very low level authenticated things right now, like reviews, right? So if you write a review in WordPress land, that's a comment. You've got to be authenticated to write that comment. So we are doing some basic authentication using that JSON web token, but it's pretty behind the scenes. It's not very something that's exposed too much, simply because, like Brandon was saying, there's something that's really not solved yet, especially when you're dealing with like 2 domains, right? There's a HTTP only cookie that you should be using to store a lot of that stuff, but there's a 5-year-old ticket that's in WordPress track that allows the WordPress set cookie function to allow some of the newer flags like secure and set HTTP only pass, right? Because a lot of the browsers now, not to go too deep into it, allow you to do these kind of cross-domain cookies, but the response from the server needs to be encoded in a certain way to allow that. So like Chrome will like stop you from doing that if it doesn't have the right types of flags like secure, and I think it says HTTP only or something like that. So, so like Brandon was saying, there's still some limitations, but there's some solutions out there too.
It sounds like an interesting problem, because I've got a Gatsby, I've got an app that I prototyped in Gatsby, and now I'm like, okay, I want to connect the back end to it and have a, sort of a membership thing. And this is the exact problem I'm kind of like up to right now.
Yeah, check out the JSON web token plugin. I'll find it really quick and I'll put it in the chat.
Thanks.
But definitely solutions out there, but it's, we're dealing with a lot of new tech, I think, which is good and bad. Good is we're on the forefront of a lot of these things. So by the time the masses catch up, we'll kind of be deep in the game, I think, but bad in the sense of like we're having to solve these problems ourselves. Anyway, there's a chat.
Thanks.
There's a link. It's the
maybe,
WP GraphQL GWT.
Okay, maybe to wrap up here, we can. I'm not sure if this was. It's a little on the edge of a joke, maybe. So I'll just go with it. But obviously, before you're obviously a React Ninja and TypeScript and all those things. But before you became as amazing as you are right now, did you ever have to build a headless application in like a jQuery or something like that, rather than a framework like React that you have access to these days?
Yeah, I don't know about Ninja. I think you're as good as React developer as I am, Brandon.
That doesn't bode well for you, buddy.
No, I haven't done anything outside of React. I think early on, I think that's probably why, a lot of this headless stuff is becoming more popular, is that the UI, tools are becoming much, much better, right? There's Next.js, which is another React framework. There's Gatsby, Vue.js, and so because these things are becoming more and more prolific, I think more and more people are gravitating to them because they can do a lot of things with them. I think early on when Angular was kind of becoming popular, like in the mid 2010s, like 2015-ish, right? A lot of people started messing around with Angular and the REST API. That was kind of the stack for like the initial headless, right? If memory serves me correctly. I never got into that. I just, on my day job, we just didn't have any projects that really kind of dealt with that. So I just never really got into that. But now I think what started all this for us was a lot of clients came to us with performance issues and wanting to improve the speed of their sites and their applications. And we were kind of stuck on the limitations of, we had done everything we could, did async, defer, did everything we could, and we were still kind of capped. So we started looking at, okay, well, maybe Headless and Gatsby can kind of help us with that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the site you showed, it was very snappy, even with the zoom effect in place. So that's one of the main reasons I think why people go with a decoupled WordPress site, is because it is so much snappier. Even I've even seen sort of like hybrid apps where people do like a single page web app, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
They use service workers and prefetch things and do all that kind of like magic and wizardry. But it almost seems like that taking that amount of effort to sort of pre-cache things is almost harder in some ways and harder to maintain, because you're still working in sort of an older sense of, a round trip to the server and coming back, but you're sort of letting the browser guess which direction the user is going to go. And sometimes it doesn't get it right, and it's slow anyway. But in this case, like you showed with that other site, like every link you click is like instant load basically. So
yeah, we need to make some performance improvements anyway on that side. We're looking to kind of try to find another solution other than Apollo. It feels a little beefy for kind of what we're doing. But yeah, like even with Gatsby, like you can start introducing like offline mode, but then like you were saying, now you're introducing more issues, like because you got caching issues, possibly because now it's coming from a service worker. But anyway.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I don't see any other questions here in the chat. Like I said, I will get this all sort of edited up and put up on YouTube for everybody to watch it later. Jacob said he's going to give me the URLs. I see some of them in the chat here, but I'll follow up with him and get all the links that he talked about tonight. And we'll get this up in the next couple of days, I would say. And that'll be awesome. Next month, we are talking about, I think we're closing up our Headless series next month. We're talking to Scott Bollinger, another Orange County guy, but he'll be talking about Headless in the sense of a mobile app built from a WordPress install. So if mobile apps is something that you're looking at, definitely join in next week. Or sorry, next month.
Scotty B, huh?
No, not next week. Yeah, Scotty B. So we'll definitely get to that and wrap that up. Well, then after that, we'll get back to our plugin development series over time. So if you're into that as well, keep following along. We're not going anywhere.